I'm now joined by three prominent Coloradans to continue our conversation about whether Colorado can be a model of how to run elections, inform our public, and tackle the challenge of climate change. Jena Griswold is Colorado's Secretary of State. Welcome, Jena.
Good morning.
Good morning. Joe Neguse is the United States representative representing the state of Colorado in Congress. Welcome, Joe.
Good morning.
Good morning. And Stewart Vanderwilt is President and CEO of Colorado Public Radio. Welcome, Stewart.
Yeah, good morning, all.
And thank you all for being with us today. Let me just begin with a broad question. From each of your perspectives, in what ways does or can Colorado serve as a model for the rest of the country? Let me start with you, Jena.
Well, we do not have enough time to answer that question because there are so many wonderful things that we do that should be adopted across the nation. In Colorado, we're fortunate that our elections are the nation's gold standard. The Colorado election system is straightforward. An eligible person registers to vote right online if that's convenient to them. They're then mailed a ballot, which they can return to one of hundreds of drop boxes or back through the mail. And of course, there's weeks of early in-person voting and same-day voter registration. That means that every eligible Republican, Democrat, and Independent can have accessible, safe, and secure elections and vote how they choose. We've been a trailblazer in elections, and our success speaks for itself. We've been described as a national leader in safeguarding elections, including by former President Trump's DHS secretary, and had the second highest turnout in the nation in 2020.
Yeah, it's really pretty impressive. Again, as I've mentioned when conversation with the governor, I've not lived here that long, and for me, it's a very impressive system. The voting is so easy and uncontroversial here. Representative Neguse, how would you answer that question? What ways does or can Colorado serve as a model for the rest of the country?
Well, I'd certainly agree with the secretary. I think that she's spot on. Colorado is a national model on all sorts of policy challenges where we have come together and been able to craft consensus around policy solutions that move the needle for the people of our state. And I often say that I spend much of my time in Washington, D.C., imploring my colleagues to emulate what we've done so successfully in Colorado. That, of course, extends to election administration, as the secretary noted, and the fact that Colorado really does have the gold standard when it comes to how to administer elections and ensure that those who are legally eligible to vote have the ability to do so in a convenient way. And that is in large part why H.R. 1 and a number of other federal pieces of legislation that we've introduced with respect to voting rights over the course of the last 2 years have been modeled after the Colorado system. But it also extends to other public policy areas and challenges that we face as a community. I think in Colorado, we are known and have a reputation for collaborative problem solving. And I suppose that's part of our mantra and way of life here in the Rocky Mountain West, the need to care for each other, to take care of your neighbor, and to help and lend a helping hand to solve a problem or a challenge that faces us all. And perhaps a perfect example of that is our work in the climate area and the climate space as it relates to forests and wildfire mitigation, resiliency. Of course, happy to talk about that in greater detail, but an example of an area in which Colorado has been able to build partnerships between local, state, and federal government entities for the benefit of our population here.
Yeah, it's great. Let me turn to you, Stewart, and ask, of course, the same question. In what ways, from your perch at Colorado Public Radio and in the media, do you see Colorado being, or can it be, a model for the rest of the country?
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. And any functioning democracy needs a strong, independent, and trusted press, one that interests are the people that it serves versus interests that may be out of state and not directly connected to our communities. And our role is to be a check on how the integrity of our institutions. And so, we do the work to follow up on the claims about voter access and the integrity of elections, as well as many other things. And so, It's essential that our press is strong, it's independent, and free and accessible to all. And we have some challenges in Colorado to ensure all of those things.
Yeah. Well, thank you for those first remarks. I'm going to sort of drill down on some of the things that you've just raised, if I can. Maybe coming back to you, Secretary Griswold. You talked about the things we have to be proud of, and just how certainly how efficient the election process is. Well, I'm curious, what further reforms do you think are needed in Colorado?
Well, I think we have the best election model in the nation. We've had vote by mail since 2014, and that's led to record access for Republicans, unaffiliated, and Democratic voters. And as Secretary of State, I've continued to innovate. So in the last 3 years, I've increased drop boxes by 55%, added 42 extra voting centers. We set up statewide ballot tracking so Coloradans can see when their ballot is mailed to them to when it's received. We rolled out new technology, including text to cure, which allows Coloradans to more easily fix signature discrepancies, which we check on the back of every mail ballot. I set up a unit to counter disinformation. The list goes on and on. So we're continuing to innovate. However, I think unlike my first 3 years, where it was really focused on how do we expand access, how do we make sure that it's simple to cast a ballot for eligible people, we now have to look inside. The nation is facing one of the worst attacks on democracy in recent history. Since the insurrection on the US Capitol, there have been over 600 bills considered across the nation to suppress the vote. Over 180 election deniers are running across the nation to oversee election administration. We've seen fake audits, vitriol, the list goes on and on. So I just announced my legislative agenda on Tuesday, and it's aimed at addressing some of these threats against democracy, including protecting election workers, closing a state patrol loophole so I can request security, passing legislation to get at insider threats. And that's when election officials try to compromise security from within. And also, focus on adding more transparency to money in politics. So that's my agenda for this year. I'm looking forward to working with the legislature and passing it so that every Republican and Democratic election worker feels safe, and so that every Republican, Democrat, and independent voter has the access they deserve as Colorado citizens and American citizens to the polls.
Yeah, it's striking to me, you have to talk about keeping election workers and for that matter, elected officials safe. I mean, so strong is the vitriol. Now I know you get threats, Joe. I know Representative Neguse, you get threats. It's worrisome, but I'm glad that you're focused on that. Certainly glad that you're focused on that issue. Let me turn to you, Representative Neguse, and maybe drill down a bit on the environmental issues and that I know you've been working on for years. And of course, the manifestations are already here and only going to get worse. Obviously, wildfires and drought and challenges of water use in this state, et cetera. And these are complicated and sometimes contentious issues about how to address them. And you referenced this, but I'd love to hear more about how we in Colorado, you in Colorado, are able to bring people together to tackle these issues.
Well, I think that's a great question, Fritz. Our country is really facing two existential threats. The first, of course, is the one that the Secretary articulated and I think eloquently described, which is the threat to our democracy, our republic, and our ability to function as a constitutional republic in light of the weakening and erosion of democratic norms that has taken place over the course of the last, in particular, half decade. But the second, of course, is an existential threat that faces not just our state and our country, but our planet, and that is the threat of climate change. And as you said, manifestations of that are all too real here in our backyard. We see that every day in a very visceral way with the wildfire seasons that have now grown to become wildfire years. Colorado has been no stranger to wildfire, as you know, but in the last 2 years, we've had the largest wildfire in our history, the second largest wildfire in our history, and the most destructive wildfire in our history. All of those have taken place literally in the last 16 months, all in my congressional district in Larimer and Boulder and Grand County. It is a wake-up call of sorts to policy advocates and policy makers, and I think to our entire community about the need to take this seriously and to invest in solutions that we know will ultimately make a difference. So with respect to your particular question about how do you bridge that divide, unfortunately, as you know, in this current political environment, everything has become politicized.
Yeah, it really has.
Much in my view, to our detriment collectively, because to the extent we are unable to see each other as fellow citizens of our wonderful country, it makes it awfully hard to lead and to solve big challenges, big problems. And of course, I can think of no challenge bigger than climate change, but we are making that effort, and I think making some progress. We created, just by way of example, a bipartisan wildfire caucus in the United States Congress. It's led by myself and John Curtis, who's a Republican from the state of Utah, represents Park City, and a good example of a way in which we can bring folks to the table with really a purpose of trying to make sure that we're following the science with respect to all of the different nuances that are involved with the pervasiveness of wildfires recently, and actually bring solutions to bear. And we've had some success in terms of increasing funding for resiliency and mitigation work in our forests, just by way of example. There's a lot more to do. It is not going to be easy. No challenge ever is, but I'm confident that working together, we can get there.
Well, that's great. And it's great to hear about some of the progress that's being made, as you point out. Unless we figure out how to bridge the divide, if it's purely polarized, purely partisan, we're not going to solve the problem, are we?
No, precisely.
Let me turn to you, Stewart. So in the course of the last day and a half, we've talked a lot about the media and its impact on polarization, for example, and problems of media disinformation. Focused, globally, nationally, but I want to turn to here in Colorado. One of the themes that is really prevalent is the challenge to local news and the dearth of local news, the ways in which certainly newspapers in this country it's really been hollowed out. And I'm curious sort of how you think we're doing in Colorado at providing information that our citizens need.
Yeah, in many ways, I would say we're on a rebound, but we're on a rebound from a pretty low point with the decline of having two major statewide newspapers that competed vigorously with each other and delivered important news to the citizens of Colorado to now having one that doesn't have a local ownership. And I think the local ownership of news is essential to our long-term service. That said, with the Colorado Media Project, with investments in CPR and other news organizations around the state, we're doing more today than we were certainly 2-3 years ago. And here's one, manifestation of it that's relevant to this conversation. We were able to look at 7 years of data of rejected ballots in Colorado to see to really test this standard that we have. And what we found in looking through all of that data was a very small percentage of ballots get rejected. But there are some patterns in those that do get rejected. And so by having the resources to dig into a story like that, to spend the months on it, to spend the money on the open records requests, we're able to present back to our state, here's where we could possibly improve. And so it's essential that there's news organizations throughout the state that can do this on the statewide level, like CPR does, but also in the communities, individual communities where people live.
That's great. Well, thank you for that. I want to turn to some questions we have from our viewing audience. A question from a Corbell student for Congressman Neguse. You previously introduced the 21st Century Conservation Corps Act. Since states like Colorado tend to run pilot programs, which then expand into federal programming, what's stopping Colorado from running a civilian Conservation Corps pilot program?
Thank you, Fritz. What a great question. My staff is going to suspect that I planted that question because Climate Conservation Corps is a program that we've been working to enact at the federal level, as the questioner pointed out, for the better part of the last 2 years. It's a program modeled after the 1930s era program that literally helped build much of the public park infrastructure that we have in the United States today. Those of you who are here in Colorado will know well the benefits of going to a concert at Red Rocks, and you might not know that Red Rocks was built by the Civil Conservation Corps, Civilian Conservation Corps of the 1930s. So the idea was to leverage the skill and the ingenuity, the talent of the American people to address a new challenge, which is climate change in the 21st century. To the questioner's point, the good news is there's nothing stopping Colorado from enacting a similar program, which is precisely why the governor has shown great leadership in doing exactly that. Last year, Governor Polis and the Lieutenant Governor Primavera announced the creation of a Colorado Climate Conservation Corps. I joined them in the hills of western Boulder County up in Nederland for the launch of a project that they were doing up there, a forest management project that was incredibly important and is incredibly important to my constituents in western Boulder County. And it's a good example, again, going to the very first question you asked, Fritz, at the top of today's program, of how Colorado can be a model. It is another example of a way in which we are modeling for the country how we can address some of these core challenges like climate change. And as I said, much of my time in Washington is now spent asking my colleagues to adopt that program and the many other programs that we've talked about during today's program.
Very good. I don't think we planted that question, so thank you for that. A question from Matt, a Corbell student. This one for Secretary Griswold, Jena. Can procedural changes like ranked choice voting promote stronger democratic participation in Colorado?
Well, that's a really good question. So ranked choice voting is an emerging trend, innovation in election administration. And basically the name explains how it works. Instead of choosing one person in a race or two, depending on the type of election, you rank your preference for who you would prefer to be in that elected position. In Colorado, passed ranked choice voting for municipal races last year so that municipalities can adopt this new innovation. Procedurally, outside of implementing it and getting voters to start using it, it's a pretty big change. And in Colorado, we are so focused on cybersecurity that it makes it even harder to implement. So we're waiting or working with the legislature this session to fund my office's implementation of that system. We need to be able to make sure that we can do bipartisan risk limiting audits, which are the best bipartisan audits in the nation on ranked choice voting. There is no program that exists to do that right now. We also have to figure out how to do election night reporting with ranked choice voting. So with these innovations, I think it's a testament to the idea that states are the laboratories of innovation, laboratories of democracy. And we're just on the cutting edge of this to roll out ranked choice voting in an extremely secure and accessible way.
That's great. I actually have a good follow-on question from Sage in Denver for you, Jena, which is, do you work with other secretaries of state to share lessons learned from Colorado and strengthen their voting systems?
Absolutely. And when they have some good ideas, we want to steal them. We are in the business of sharing our innovations. And one of the things that I'm really proud of is that in 2020, we were there for the nation in helping expand vote by mail. So I was speaking with secretaries of state across the country about how do I do signature verification? How many drop boxes do I need? Heck, how do I get these mail ballots? And our elections division, which has been renowned far before I became Secretary of State, was consulting with almost, on phone calls with every state in the nation and consulting with anybody there. So on vote by mail, we always want to lend a hand. There's also been 2 states interested in the unit I set up to combat foreign disinformation. This is an extremely important topic that is really hard to tackle, and they're considering setting up units in their states. Colorado was a pioneer on bipartisan ranked choice voting. That's expanded across the nation. So we want to continue to lean in, but sometimes, we're behind the curve. And one of the pieces of legislation I'm running this year, working with our legislature to pass, is the Vote Without Fear Act. And that would prohibit open carry within 100 feet of a drop box or a voting center, because every eligible voter, regardless of the color of their skin, their zip code, or the amount of money in their bank account, deserves to vote without intimidation. 49% of Americans right now already live in a state with those types of rules. So sometimes we have to play catch up, and that's what we do also to make sure that we continue to be the leading state for election administration.
Thank you. And we only have a few minutes left. Let me ask of all of you, just if you had one thing to point to, what is one thing Colorado can do to be a better model of democracy, one in which all voices are heard and in which the public is well informed, and that's capable of delivering on issues like adapting to climate change? And let me turn to you first, Stewart. Your thoughts about what would be the one thing that you would emphasize in the media realm?
Yeah, access to public records is essential to the type of investigative reporting work that we do, and Colorado could improve in that area. The fees that are established for public records are established by individual departments and agencies, and there's kind of no rhyme or reason for how those fees are set. We'll pay what we have to pay to get to the records in the public interest, but for an individual citizen who may be trying to find out why a pipeline is being built through their neighborhood, their access is much more limited. And so Colorado, I think, can focus on its CORA law and how to make access to public records more equitable.
That's great. Secretary Griswold, you've mentioned a number of things, but if you had to pick one, what would you point to?
Well, I think we need to continue to work on campaign finance reform. Democracy, of course, a large part of it is elections, but what we see very often across the nation is that if a candidate or an elected official doesn't like their voters, they suppress the vote, they gerrymander the voters they don't like, or they just ignore them from the millions and millions and millions of dollars that get pumped into our campaigns, often in the dark money, to really overpower the voices of everyday people. Fritz, I grew up in rural Colorado, on and off of food stamps, in and out of food banks, in a cabin with an outhouse outside. I'm not the typical person to serve in this type of office, and the values of growing up working class and growing up rural, I bring with me to statewide office. So I think campaign finance reform, which I've been pushing successfully in 2019, but there's more that we need to do, is about making sure that everyday people who grew up like me, people who don't live necessarily in the cities, just normal people, have their voices heard.
That's great, thank you. And Representative Neguse, your thoughts, if there's one thing you would point to that would help us be a better model here in Colorado for the nation?
Well, I think Colorado's doing a phenomenal job. It's the federal government that needs a whole lot of work. So that's where most of my focus is. I certainly agree with Stewart's point regarding public records, and would concur with the Secretary with respect to campaign finance reform. To the extent we were able to accomplish both of those at the state and federal level in terms of FOIA, we'd be well served. My recommendation, I don't know, would necessarily be anything statutory in the sense of, recommendation for the state legislature to adopt, but more for us collectively as a community to think about. As the Secretary said, we have a very engaged citizenry here in Colorado. My congressional district in 2018 had the highest voter participation in the United States of America of any congressional district. And while I'd like to think that was because of the candidate on the ballot, I know that was not the case, and that it had far more to do with the election administration system that the Secretary described. But I'd like to see that same level of engagement to extend to other parts of our democracy here at home. That means having citizens that engage in more direct democracy, right? Participating in your local city councils and town boards, participating on local boards and commissions, being willing to send an email, send a note, make a phone call to your elected representative to tell them what's on your mind. To the extent that we could be a state where our citizenry is all in and fully engaged in our democracy, boy, I think that would be a wonderful message to send to the rest of the country. Democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires the commitment of each and every citizen to make it work. I think Colorado does it well, but there's always room for improvement.
Well, I think that's a great message to end on. I use the quote as well, that democracy is not a spectator sport. And I suppose that's the overarching theme of what we're trying to do here with the Denver Democracy Summit, is call attention to these issues, but also hopefully to inspire people to really engage. It really is all hands on deck at this point. So let me end there. Let me thank all of you for being with us today. Really appreciate your time. Secretary Jena Griswold, Representative Joe Neguse, and Stewart Vanderwilt. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Yep. Bye.
Thank you.